Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. The Indonesia plane crash that happened at the end of October, that was Lion Air Flight 610. 189 people were killed. The investigation into that crash showed that the pilots had the plane unexpectedly go nose down on them while they were trying to lift it up. That was a Boeing 737 MAX 8. Boeing 737 is the most popular, the most widely sold modern passenger aircraft in the world. And this is the new 737. This was a new plane, the new iteration of that absolute workhorse of the commercial aviation industry. But in that new plane, something happened shortly after takeoff on that day in October. The pilots were reportedly basically wrestling with the plane, trying to get its nose up, but an automatic leveling feature in the plane seems to have been fighting them, pushing the nose down. The pilots on that flight requested permission to return to the airport because of the trouble they were having with that aircraft, but shortly after making that request, the plane went down, hit the ocean. 189 people killed. Then this weekend on Sunday, it was in Ethiopia. Same type of plane, the new 737 MAX 8, the new iteration of the Boeing 737 jet. This time, 157 people were killed. And the circumstances appear to have been remarkably similar. The investigation into the crash this weekend in Ethiopia has only just begun. We don't yet know how closely it will ultimately be mapped onto the circumstances of that other recent plane crash, of that other same kind of plane in Indonesia. But this one was very soon after takeoff, while the plane was ascending. Flight data shows the plane initially ascended as normal, then it descended, then it ascended sharply again while accelerating. And as in the previous crash in Indonesia, the pilot this weekend in Ethiopia radioed back to the airport, asked to return to the airport from which he had just taken off because of the trouble he was having with that aircraft. But soon after relaying that request, again, flight crashed. No survivors, 157 people dead. Now, it was the same kind of plane in each crash. Boeing insists these planes are safe. But after these two crashes, under remarkably similar circumstances, nearly 350 people killed between them. I mean, in the modern age, in the modern aviation age, trained commercial pilots flying large commercial passenger jets just don't crash them very often. This doesn't happen, let alone twice in 5 months. And you know, maybe it's just a coincidence that these two brand new jets of the exact same kind came down in similar circumstances within just a few months of each other. But now that both of these crashes have happened in this close proximity, news organizations, including the AP and the Dallas Morning News this afternoon, today have been scanning a U.S. database where American commercial pilots can voluntarily report aviation incidents and aviation concerns. And it turns out that in this publicly accessible database, there's a whole bunch of reports that show American pilots flying American commercial flights, expressing not just concerns about this particular new Boeing aircraft, but American pilots on domestic flights describing the same sort of difficulty on takeoff, the same specific problem where they're ascending after takeoff, rising toward their cruising altitude, when something in the automated systems in that plane basically takes over and pulls the nose down. Here's one from a first officer, so from basically the co-pilot of a Boeing 737 MAX. This is a U.S. flight that happened sometime in November 2018. Quote, "Day 3 of 3, departing in a MAX 8 after a long overnight. I was well rested. On departure, we had strong crosswinds directly off the right wing. The aircraft accelerated normally, and the captain engaged the A autopilot after reaching set speed. Within 2 to 3 seconds, the aircraft pitched nose down. I called descending just prior to an aircraft safety system sounding, 'Don't sink, don't sink.' The captain immediately disconnected the autopilot and pitched into a climb. The remainder of the flight was uneventful. We discussed the departure at length, and I reviewed in my mind the automation setup and flight profile, but can't think of any reason the aircraft would pitch nose down so aggressively." That's from a first officer. Here's another one. This one is from an American captain this time, from the pilot. reporting on a domestic flight in the United States, again sometime in November 2018, and this captain describes a remarkably similar circumstances. After what the captain describes as a takeoff and climb in light to moderate turbulence, the plane's nose started to dive. Quote, the pilot monitoring system called descending, followed by an almost immediate, don't sink, don't sink. Quote, the pilot monitoring system called descending, followed by an almost immediate, don't sink, don't sink. Quote, I immediately disconnected autopilot. It was engaged and resumed climb. With the concerns with the MAX 8 nose down stuff, we both thought it appropriate to bring it to your attention. So in this database, again, which is this place where pilots and first officers can report concerns and flight difficulties without worrying about career repercussions for themselves. They just post this information and allow it to go into this database. The synopsis at the end of that one is actually nice and blunt. Quote, B737 MAX captain reports autopilot anomaly, which led to an undesired brief nose down situation. I mean, so these things are out there in this public database. Quote, aircraft pitched nose down after engaging autopilot on departure. And, you know, I am not a trained aviation professional. Statistically speaking, neither are you. But people who are aviation safety professionals, the world over, are all having the same reaction to all of this news. As of today, the list of countries that has suspended all flights of this specific type of Boeing aircraft includes the UK, France, Germany, Australia, China, Singapore, UAE, Oman, Kuwait, Malaysia, India. Stop me when you've heard enough. After a bunch of major European countries started individually banning 737 MAX 8s today, the overall aviation safety regulator for the whole of the European Union stepped in. And for the whole EU, they blocked all flights by these Boeing planes. And that's in addition to specific airlines all over the world taking it upon themselves to stop flights by these planes, whether or not their country of origin or their destination country specifically has banned them. And this is an unequivocal reaction everywhere outside the United States. I mean, some countries, including the UK, aren't just banning takeoffs and landings by these planes. They're even banning overflights by these planes, which means they won't allow these planes to be flown over their airspace. These planes are to be kept out of their airspace until further notice, even if they're not planning on landing inside the UK. But that is not how it's being handled here at home in the United States, which has long been the international gold standard and essentially the international arbiter of what counts as passenger airline safety standards. I mean, as all of these global airlines and all of these countries around the world banned flights by these Boeing aircraft, here is our FAA as of tonight. Quote, thus far, our review shows no systemic performance issues and provides no basis to order grounding the aircraft. Now, I mean, this could be happening at any time in modern American history, right? I mean, this type of a crisis in the global aviation industry is the sort of technologically driven surprise external security crisis that you don't wish on anybody, right? And it just makes you wish and hope and pray for competence and capacity in the leadership you've got that has to deal with a crisis like this at all levels, right? You just want, this is the sort of thing that makes you want really good, really smart, really qualified people in place when a crisis like this arises. With this particular crisis happening now, at this point in our country, of course, we have some novel concerns right now in our country that we might not necessarily have with any other president in place, with any other presidential administration in place. For example, that statement from the FAA today saying everything's fine, as far as they can tell, everything's fine, no need to worry. As you can see from the sort of headline there that we've got marked there in orange, that statement was put out in the name of the acting FAA administrator, Daniel K. Elwell. And nothing against Mr. Elwell whatsoever. But it is a little bit odd, if you think about it, that this far into the Trump administration, more than 2 years into the Trump presidency, why do we still have an acting administrator in place at the FAA? I mean, Mr. Elwell has been there in an acting capacity since President Obama's FAA administrator left the job when his term came to an end in January 2018, well over a year ago. And again, I'm not casting aspersions whatsoever on the acting administrator himself, but the reason there isn't a Senate-confirmed official permanent leader in that agency even now is because President Trump hasn't even formally nominated anybody for the job. I mean, within the last few days, he said that it's been reported that he is expected to name a Delta executive for the job, but nobody's nominated yet. And this time last year, the guy he was putting forward as his first choice for the job, remember that? His own personal pilot. President Trump wanted to install as the administrator of the FAA the guy who flies the Trump plane. Not Air Force One, the plane that says Trump on it. Remember the one from the campaign? I remember at the time, they even tried to roll this out like it was some sort of bold, smart move by Trump that he would tap his own plane's pilot to run the FAA. They even rolled out an anonymous administration official to try to sell reporters on it. Quote, John Duncan isn't just a pilot. He oversaw the Trump presidential campaign's air fleet, says anonymous White House official put out for this purpose. Oh, he oversaw the Trump campaign's air fleet. Well, no one's disputing that's true, but remember during the campaign when the Trump presidential campaign plane got grounded for a while? The heat of the campaign, it was like late April 2016. The reason his campaign plane got grounded is because it turned out they'd been flying that jet for months without it being registered. Oops. Yeah, well, the director of aviation for the Trump organization, who's responsible both for flying the plane and for directing all aviation operations, for making sure that stuff like, I don't know, the plane is registered so it can legally fly, that's the guy who President Trump initially tapped to put in charge of America's $18 billion federal regulatory agency overseeing the international gold standard in airline safety. He's so good at flying my plane, except for the fact that it's but look, he's an expert. He works for me. He's got to be the best. Only the best people. That did not work out. That time the president wanted to nominate his personal pilot to run the FAA, that nomination did not ultimately come to fruition. But apparently that's the only person he wanted, as far as he could imagine in terms of a good person for the job. So here we are, 2 years into the Trump administration. There's still an acting director. And now, tonight, the FAA increasingly stands alone on the international stage and saying these Boeing planes, they're fine. We see no problem whatsoever here. And again, there are just novel concerns we never had to think about before this presidency. But since President Trump has been in office, the CEO of Boeing, the company that makes these planes, has made a point of visiting with the president at the president's private for-profit Florida club, Mar-a-Lago. Since this crisis has emerged, it's reported today that same CEO has been personally lobbying the president by phone, surely reminding him of his Mar-a-Lago trips and telling the president that the planes are just great, there's no problem, definitely shouldn't be grounded here in the United States, no, everything's fine. Boeing says they're fine. And as of right now, that's what the FAA is saying too, alone in the world. Now, that position by the president and by the FAA is being rejected on a bipartisan basis on Capitol Hill. Rejected by senators who range from Elizabeth Warren to Ted Cruz to Dianne Feinstein to Mitt Romney. There have been multiple bipartisan statements today from senators from all over the country defying the president on this, defying the FAA on this, calling on these planes to be grounded in the United States like they are all around the world. Senator Cruz oversees a key subcommittee that has oversight responsibilities in the aviation industry. Senator Cruz says he will convene an emergency hearing to try to address this matter. You might remember back in the Obama administration in 2013, there was another Boeing plane that was ordered grounded all across the United States. Do you remember that? That wasn't the 737, that was the Boeing 787. And back in 2013, all of those planes were grounded on orders from the US government when there was what seemed to be a recurring problem with overheating battery packs, overheating lithium-ion battery packs. And at that time, when that problem arose in 2013, President Obama's transportation secretary ordered Boeing to ground all of its 787s. The grounding ultimately lasted less than a month. Boeing crafted a new part, a little fire-resistant compartment to put around those batteries, and that passed muster, and ultimately the planes were back up and flying. The transportation secretary in the Obama administration was former Republican Congressman Ray LaHood. He spoke with the Associated Press today in the context of this new crisis. He pointed out today that even if the FAA continues with this line that everything's fine, nothing's worth worrying about here, we're not going to do anything. Even if the FAA hews to this line, Ray LaHood is pointing out that Trump's transportation secretary, who's now Elaine Chao, she has the power, if she so chooses, to overrule the FAA and to herself order the grounding of these Boeing 737s. If she feels like it is warranted, she can do it on her own say-so as Secretary of Transportation. Ray LaHood speaking out to the Associated Press about that today, reminding Transportation Secretary Elaine Chao of her power to do so, and in fact, calling on her to do that in the case of these Boeing 737 MAXs. So these planes are being grounded all over the world. In some cases, it's not just takeoffs and landings, it's overflights even. I mean, countries closing their airspace to these American planes. Airlines all over the world are stopping flying these Boeing planes. In some cases today, airlines that had flights in the air, this type of plane in the air, in some cases, airlines today turned those flights around mid-air, flew them back to where they started and grounded them once they landed, wouldn't even let them complete their flights. While here in the United States, we've got a president who's been personally chatting to the CEO of this company on this matter, who's apparently been telling him everything's fine, nothing is worth worrying about here. Hey, do you maybe want to play golf next week? The president's FAA would now be led by the president's pilot from his own private jet if the president had had his way on the matter with the FAA, but he didn't. As a consolation prize, we still have no permanent person running that agency more than 2 years into this presidency. The FAA, for its part in all this, says everything's fine, no need to worry. Now, Congress may try to act, including Republicans in Congress who may try to act. The transportation secretary apparently has the option to act, although she is the wife of the top Republican in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, and so maybe it's hard to imagine her making such a decision outside the political crosswinds. But there's one other piece of this that you may not have heard about today that you should know about in the middle of this crisis. And honestly, you should know about it because I think it'll curl your hair. Again, remember, based on these two recent crashes of this type of plane that have killed almost 350 people, based on those crashes, and based on other similar descriptions from American pilots describing domestic flights here in the U.S. in this type of plane, describing a similar problem that they have encountered in these planes, remember that what pilots at least are describing as the problem here, what their perceived problem with this aircraft is, appears to be related to some kind of automated system, an automated leveling system in this plane that for some reason on departure has a propensity or at least an episodic problem in which it unexpectedly yanks the plane's nose down toward the ground when the plane is supposed to be climbing. Well, the good news is it turns out that Boeing has in the works a software fix that they believe will address that problem in these planes. Good. The Wall Street Journal had the scoop on this afternoon, and where it ends is not good. But here's where it starts. Quote, Boeing is making an extensive change to the flight control system in these 737 MAX aircraft, going beyond what many industry officials familiar with the discussions had anticipated. The change would mark a major shift from how Boeing originally designed a stall prevention feature in the aircraft. The company spokesman confirmed the update would use multiple sensors, or data feeds, in the plane's stall prevention system, instead of the current reliance on a single sensor. The change was prompted by preliminary results from the Indonesian crash investigation of Lion Air Flight 610 in October. Those preliminary crash investigation results indicated that erroneous data from a single sensor, which measures the angle of the plane's nose, caused the stall prevention system to misfire. And then a series of events put the aircraft into a dangerous dive. The anticipated software fix from Boeing, quote, will limit the extent of the flight control system's downward push on the plane's nose. That seems like a good idea. How soon are they going to have it ready? Well, according to this scoop today from the Wall Street Journal, the FAA, U.S. aviation regulators, are now expected to mandate this change in software in these Boeing planes, by the end of next month. Okay, so that's still a ways off, but at least it's in the works. They believe they've got a way to fix the accidental nosedive problem. You know, why didn't you say so? How soon could this thing have been ready? Should it have been ready before the Ethiopia plane crash this week that killed 157 people? Well, here's the backstory on the timing of when this thing is going to be able to be rolled out. Ready? A software fix to this particular flight control feature had been expected early in January. But discussions between the FAA and Boeing dragged on. Officials from various parts of Boeing and the FAA had differing views of how extensive the fix should be. U.S. officials also say the federal government's recent shutdown halted work on the fix entirely for 5 weeks. So did everybody enjoy their 35-day government shutdown? I mean, you might have thought we got nothing out of that as a country. But it turns out not just us, but the whole world got something. We got a 5-week delay in the implementation of the software that they think will solve the unexpected nosedive problem in the Boeing 737 MAX 8 jets. And in the meantime, Ethiopia Airlines Flight 302 has crashed, killing more than 150 people. The investigation into that crash is now underway, closely on the heels of the other 737 MAX 8 crash that happened in Indonesia. And now countries all over the world and airlines all over the world are grounding these flights. Sometimes in the middle of flights, turning those flights around and grounding them, grounding these planes, prohibiting these planes from even flying through their airspace, throwing global passenger aviation into chaos. And maybe now this gets fixed by the end of next month. But in the meantime, here in the US, continue to enjoy your flights on Boeing 737 MAX 8 aircraft. Don't worry, the president talks to the Boeing CEO on the phone about it all the time. And the president himself knows aviation. After all, he had the best pilot you could ever imagine. It was amazing. He would have been perfect to run the FAA. I don't know why anybody didn't go along with it. Or, maybe Elaine Chao will fix it. So, it's easy for everybody to take pot shots at government, right? And the people who run government, the people who work in government, until something comes up and it turns out you really need it, and you really need them, and you really need them to be great. You really need them to be up to it. And usually in the middle of the crisis, it's too late to go back and make sure you've got all the right people in place and you made good decisions about who ought to be running things. But that crisis is full-fledged right now, and there are, there's a lot going on. There's a lot else besides that in the news. There's a ton of plates that are basically spinning in the air right now. The big Brexit vote today was in the UK. The Brexit plan, still not approved by the British Parliament. There's going to be 2 more crucial votes over the next 2 days that will determine the fate of what is going to happen between the European Union and our closest overseas ally, the UK. The prospect of a catastrophic economic and regulatory break between the UK and the EU at the end of this month is still very much live. The ongoing political crisis in Venezuela now has rapidly unspooled into a fairly massive humanitarian catastrophe. We're going to have more coming up on that later on this hour with Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy. The big college cheating scandal that was exposed today is just mind-boggling. If you did not see Chris Hayes' show, his discussion on this earlier this evening, watch the Chris Hayes rerun later on tonight. He had excellent coverage on this story. But today we saw dozens of indictments and arrests announced by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts. Because there are celebrities and rich people and rich, famous universities involved in this scandal, you can expect this one to play out for a long while yet. But today is day 1 of this revelation of a massive bribery and cheating scandal with America's very top colleges. And on top of all of that, the out-of-control spinning carousel of scandal around this president is about to enter one of its most kinetic and dramatic periods yet. Today, prosecutors filed notice with the federal court in Virginia that they want the president's campaign chair, Paul Manafort, to pay $25 million in restitution, on top of the 4-year prison sentence the judge in that case has already given him. That restitution part, the $25 million, that will not be addressed by that judge in Virginia until after Paul Manafort is sentenced by a different federal judge tomorrow in a different jurisdiction in Washington, D.C. That Manafort sentencing hearing in D.C. is due to start at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Now, in terms of monitoring what happens there, it's federal court, so there's not going to be any cameras in the courtroom. I can tell you there will be lots of reporters in the courtroom. You should expect live coverage fairly soon after that hearing starts tomorrow. Again, that's Paul Manafort's second federal sentencing tomorrow, 9:30 in the morning Eastern Time. He's facing up to an additional 10 years in prison. And tonight, I am told, since we have been on the air, that's what this is, that was delivered to me moments ago. I am told that we just got in an update from prosecutors in the special counsel's office on the troubling case of Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn. You will remember that Mike Flynn was essentially thrown out of his sentencing hearing in December by a federal judge who was sort of all but warning him that he was not going to like his sentence if he went ahead with it that day in December. Wouldn't General Flynn like to go back to go work with prosecutors some more, to see if he could become an even better cooperator, to see if he could do anything else to mitigate the sentence this judge was prepared to give him that day in that court in December? General Flynn finally realized what the judge was trying to tell him and agreed he would go back and cooperate further, try to improve his station further before this judge sentenced him. That was 3 months ago. Tonight is the first time we have heard from prosecutors since about what has happened between them and Mike Flynn since that bizarre and dramatic day in that courtroom in December when his sentencing got called off. There will be a status conference in the Flynn case tomorrow. We've just started to get in the documents. We've just started to get in tonight the documents that will be the predicate of that sentencing hearing for Mike Flynn tomorrow. We're going to get to more on that breaking news in just a moment. That's just happening right now. And on top of all of that, authorities in New York State, interestingly, in both the legislature and in law enforcement, in the Attorney General's office, they have started today to turn their own state-level law enforcement resources on this president and his business. And they're starting to do it like they've got him in a tractor beam. State law enforcement sort of sounds less threatening than federal law enforcement when you're talking about a federal elected official like a president. In this case, don't be so sure. And in this case specifically, there may be some special problems for this president when it comes to the prospect of state-level charges or even investigations emanating from New York State targeted at him and his family and his business. So we've got more on that coming up as well. But again, we'll have some breaking news for you on what's expected tomorrow from Mike Flynn, the president's national security advisor, who looks like he may finally be facing the music. That hearing is tomorrow, and that story's next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.